Angus Duncan was appointed to the Northwest Power Planning Council in 1990 by Governor Goldschmidt and reappointed in 1993 by Governor Roberts. He presently serves as chairman of the council. Previously, he has served as council vice chair, as chair of the Power Committee, and as the council's representative on the Bonneville Reinvention Sounding Board. On a national level, Mr. Duncan previously served as Director of Energy Policy in the U.S. Department of Transportation under President Carter. He represented the city of Portland in regional energy debates of the 1970s that led to congressional passage of the Northwest Power Planning and Conservation Act. He's one of the early authors of language to treat conservation as a regional energy resource and to express a statutory regional preference for conservation and renewable energy resources, and to establish a regional planning council accountable to the 4 Northwest states. Mr. Duncan has often spoken about the need to address the effect which power generation has on natural systems. He notes that wild salmon runs and resource-based rural Oregon communities are also in conflict. How often do we hear that salmon runs are dying and that the economies of timber towns have to diversify in order to survive? Mr. Duncan apparently feels that by working together we can save both wild salmon runs and the resource-based economies. Let's hear what he has to say about these issues. Please join me in welcoming Angus Duncan.
Thank you very much. I had any number of witty and rude remarks to make about Don Frisbee, and Don elected to go on vacation. I assume he saw an advanced copy of the text, Isaac. I've got some that I'll reserve for you if that's necessary and appropriate, depending on the first question.
It just got tougher.
Well, my hope today is to explore with you some of the dilemmas that are created when communities of people come in conflict with natural systems, that is, with communities of other species. And this, together with the management of nuclear weapons, are to me the first order questions for humans as we prepare to cross over into the 21st century. But I hope you will indulge me a slight digression. It's more a kind of an introductory comment on the unfolding drama of the Bonneville Power Administration and its customers, one human community, and the salmon of the Columbia River. This is a drama that Bonneville so far would like to confine to the business section of the paper. Utility takes hard-nosed actions to stay competitive and hold its customers. Bonneville asks to be judged in these terms, but Bonneville is more than that, or it is less than that. It is a public agency with a greater public purpose than selling the lowest cost kilowatt, or it is just another utility that should be privatized, stripped of its public burdens and its advantages, including exclusive access to the federal hydropower system and treasury financing, and left to compete with other private utilities. That, I think, would be regrettable. The Bonneville that I will fight vigorously to preserve is the agency we described in the Northwest Power Act 15 years ago. It's an agency with a public trust that runs to low-cost energy, certainly, but calculated to fully include environmental costs in that equation. It is a trust that runs to investing in new renewable and conservation technologies that promise a better future for our children. And most of all, it is a trust that runs to the stewardship of the Columbia River, not just the main stem projects, but the entire complex ecosystem that depends utterly on a living, breathing river, not a lifeless system of canals and dams and pools. Yes, Bonneville needs to survive financially in order to pay for these good works, but its competitiveness should not and need not be achieved on the backs of fish, of tribal treaty rights, and of residential ratepayers in Oregon and Washington. Bad nuclear investments by Bonneville and its public utility and aluminum company customers 20 years ago should not and need not be paid for by the salmon. Bonneville has other financial options. We've laid many of these out for the agency, But as of now, this is the choice the agency and some members of Congress are pressing to a decision this summer, maybe even this month. I call this a drama. It has many of the elements of tragic choice, an ironic consequence about it. Bonneville can save itself. Will it trade away its soul, its public purpose, in order to do so? And with that preface, I'd like now to state a larger question. How do we transform a culture organized around presumptions of energetic growth and inexhaustible resources to fuel that growth into one that manages for sustainability without stagnation, into a society that can still grow, can still reward human aspiration and ingenuity without consuming the natural resource base on which those aspirations ultimately depend? There are, in my view, first and second order of magnitude questions to take up. In the first category are the easy ones, the comparatively easy questions of the economics and the science. When I joined the Power Council 5 years ago, I thought if we could just get the science right and get the economic signals lined up, issues like salmon recovery and renewable energy might pretty well solve themselves. And I marvel in retrospect at how little I knew then of the primitive state of salmon science, just to take one example. What's the difference between wild and hatchery fish? What are the descendants of hatchery fish that now spawn in the wild? How does all that genetic inventory interact? What happens to a stream when we deprive it of an annual deposition of nutrients borne in by the salmon that spawn and die in those headwaters? What happens to the food web in an estuary when we deprive it of an annual spring flood of snowmelt? We don't know the answers to most of those questions still. The economics would have been easier had the science been clearer. What's more cost effective? Diverting flows from the power system to help the smolts migrate instream, or putting the fish into barges? Biology provides economics with no bright lines here. The answers vary with volume and timing of annual flows, with beliefs about sources of salmon mortality, with assumptions of subtle but crucial signals that may be missed by salmon in barges. And so we are obliged to continue both approaches and to incur the costs of both, at least into the indefinite future. So much for simple-minded cost effectiveness. As difficult as these questions of science and economics are, I believe we are capable technically of handling them if we apply adaptive management techniques to risk and uncertainty, and, it's a big and here, and if we begin to address the second order of magnitude questions. These are, to me, the truly difficult ones, and I'd like to try a few of them out on you. The first question is one of thresholds and burden of proof. Species like salmon evolve to fill ecological niches. They develop over time a comparative advantage in filling one niche or another. The process is highly dynamic. Some species expand their reach and squeeze out others. We'll leave aside for today, I think, the issues of biodiversity and our reliance on it and its catastrophic declines. The concern here is that while species survive and prosper within their niches, they decline and die when evolutionary conditions are changed dramatically and suddenly. They die of stress or disease, or they're displaced by competitors better suited to the new conditions. Salmon evolved over millions of years to fairly precise natural conditions of water temperature and snowmelt and clean gravel, conditions that we have modified almost past recognition in the past 150 years of harvests and dams and polluted streams and misguided hatchery and harvest practices. Many runs have been pushed past the thresholds of survivability, and they're gone. Our societal response has been to seek balance between human claims and the needs of other species. I tell the story of an Eastern Oregon farmer, a friend of mine, who was concerned, this is a couple of years ago, he's learned, concerned over fish declines, but he was also concerned for his livelihood, as he might be. And I observed that the temperatures in his stream were reaching 80 degrees in August, while salmon need water no warmer than 68. And he thought for a while, and he said he would do whatever it took to bring those temperatures down to 74. He'd split the difference. Fair enough. And the problem, of course, is that above 68 degrees, the fish die. And the point is that thresholds exist in science, and they matter. And they're not often subject to debate as though we were negotiating tax law or electricity rates. Yet when we seek to back off other uses and to return water quality to these survival values, we're blocked not just by scientific uncertainty, but by the assignment of burden of proof to the fish and benefit of the doubt to human uses. Most dam operators will acknowledge pretty convincing evidence that flows in the Columbia lower than about 160,000 cubic feet per second, it's a lot of water, do not adequately support smolt migration. Many fish managers believe flows should remain above 300,000 CFS, almost twice the early level. The hard evidence for these levels is sparse. What's the answer? Well, for many of the utilities and many of their industrial customers, it is to provide only the flow levels for which there is conclusive proof of need. A couple of years ago, these parties insisted on an independent review of the science. We thought that was a good idea, so we contracted. The council contracted with Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which reported back after a year's review that there was indeed a positive correlation between higher flow levels and salmon survival. It was a complex, not precise, but a real and a scientifically explainable correlation. That was not the answer some of these folks wanted. The Oak Ridge report failed their test of precise, unequivocal, bright-line science. Of course, that result was almost guaranteed, evolutionary biology and ecology being fields with many variables and very few constants. But their markets wanted predictability. Markets select sales and revenue data over scientific uncertainty. Markets insist on the benefit of the doubt. They project the burden of proof onto salmon and watersheds. Markets are fundamentally short-term. They demand short-term proofs. Ecological systems will deliver proofs, but usually over great expanses of time by human standards, and in a fashion that in many cases is fundamentally irreversible. The risk that we run in selecting the science that suits our appetites is that we will deny species their threshold requirements for survival. When we invade and modify stream habitat, for example, we may address first-order issues like bank erosion. Frequently we do. But we often have very little interest in or patience with the more obscure questions, floodplain connections, food web disturbances. In every case, the airs of ignorance must be sustained by the species, and the benefit of the doubt goes to us. And this leads to a second condition of concern, seeking engineering solutions to biological questions. On the one hand, we applaud Yankee ingenuity, and we should. It has built much of what is distinctive and rewarding in America. It has given us mobility and medical treatments and artificial intelligence that are the envy of nations. We end up assuming that technology can solve about anything, and so on the Columbia, we continue trying to engineer our way out of biological problems that often are themselves the consequences of engineering successes. Now, leave aside the pyramid of failed fixes to salmon mortality at the great dams on the Columbia and on the Snake. You've heard a lot about those already. To me, the most pathetic example of misguided engineering was the fish manager's practice, since, I hope, discontinued, of clearing beaver dams and log jams to improve fish passage up streams that salmon had successfully negotiated for millions of years. Engineering is capable of building fish ladders alongside the dams and mimicking this simple accessory step in one phase of the salmon life cycle. Even this measure has not been uniformly successful, which should have given us pause, but with the hubris of the age, we then proceeded to construct a hatchery system that sought to replicate a whole stage in the life cycle, egg to smolt. In retrospect, it is painfully obvious how unsatisfactory would be the substitution of incubators and trays and food pellets for the complex interactions of water temperature and composition, of flow, of food web, of competition, of predation, and of all the other elements of hatching and rearing in a healthy headwater stream. Neither did we anticipate the genetic and the other implications of hatchery and wild fish encounters after hatchery release. Transporting the fish in barges on the ground that it kills fewer fish than the appallingly hostile in-river conditions we otherwise subject them to is another example. But I expect we will exhaust this reservoir of technological hubris before we will move decisively to heal the river. A third condition is the one that we know as the tragedy of the commons. Most of you, I think, are familiar with the derivation of this figure from villagers who graze their livestock on pasture held in common. In a village, the consequences of overconsumption by a few are proximate enough that agreements can be forged among users and sanctions can be devised for violators. In a country the size of ours, we have recourse to regulation of use by rule book or increasingly by channeling market forces, and it is essential that we establish clear and equitable terms for the use of our common goods, for the airshed, for the waters, for the land, so that no user is put at a disadvantage in the market for respecting their value as a common good. We cannot ask private businesses to observe an environmental ethic at the price of becoming non-competitive and losing market share to a competitor with very different ethics. But neither can we allow short-term market forces, in effect cash flow and quarterly returns, to determine the best long-term use and conservation of the commons. And now there is the almost paralyzing problem of managing the resources held in common by all of us on the planet. Greenhouse warming, high seas overfishing, pollution plumes that drift over frontiers, water that flows across international borders. These are issues no country can manage unilaterally. Today, any country may consume without penalty its share and more. The problems are compounded by the race between, on the one hand, our economic hunger to consume the commons and our technical capacity to do so, and on the other, by the slowly developing institutions we rely on to manage such use globally. And we are speaking only of this generation's appetites. Our ability to measure environmental effects not captured by market forces is in its infancy. Our ability to properly value these impacts over generations is primitive, and our inclination to do so is weak at best. Human beings operate with very high discount rates. Speaking metaphorically, we value cash flow more than near-term returns. We value our time on Earth far more than we do our hypothetical grandchildren's. We value a human life saved today, one study showed, as much as 6 saved 25 years from now, or 44 saved 100 years from now. Long-term possibilities versus short-term certainties. There are some good reasons for high discount rates. In the long run, as economists delight to remind us, we are all dead. But the consequence is increasingly a mismatch with natural systems that operate on far longer cycles than do we. We value cheap fossil fuel today at the risk of 100 years of global warming and counting. We value cheap beef today from ranches carved out of the Brazilian rainforest, and we dismiss species losses of a magnitude not known since the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, a loss that took the Earth 20 million years, more than 2,000 times the span of recorded human history, to repair. No other generation in human history will bequeath to its successors a world so full of uncertainty and peril at best and impossible burdens at worst as we will if we deny our responsibility as stewards. We have to fix these discount rates. The next issue is what I call cultural and historical inertia. How do we change those values that had a practical worth 100 years ago but are counterproductive today? This is a problem I see often in my job. The rancher or the farmer or the fisherman who practiced his husbandry for decades, often as his father did and perhaps his grandfather also, on the same plot of ground. With technology, maybe he's able to plant more acres, or fish more river miles, or maybe he's taking no more water out of the river than his father did 50 years ago. Maybe he's running no more cattle. That level of consumption wasn't a problem 50 years ago, before most of the dams went in, before 8 million people lived in the Pacific Northwest, before slackwater navigation was extended to Lewiston, Idaho. Salmon could live with poaching on the edges of their habitat 50 years ago. Today, users blanket this river from its rising to its emptying out and out into the ocean. But ranchers and fishermen that I deal with don't always understand how values can sometimes change. How could it be good to break the soil and subdue nature then, but it's wrong now? Do these people have to forswear their family histories, confess the sins of their fathers and mothers? Is it any wonder that environmental issues polarize when not just livelihoods, but family histories and family values, long held, are challenged? The history of the West is one of mastering an often harsh and unforgiving land. Wallace Stegner wrote, "Aridity gives the Western landscape its character. It calls the tune, directs our tinkering, prevents the healing of our mistakes." We entered into this Western land with wholly admirable exuberance and imagination, with a passion to fill up empty spaces, and with a belief that we could remake the deserts of the West into the gardens of the East, and with no concept that we could ever exhaust the sheer immensity and vigor of this land. So the communities were built around grazing and mining and logging and irrigated farming, all grounded in these assumptions. Conservation was conceived of as a way to extend the resource for further but ultimately complete consumption. Over time, practices that proved useful in ordering consumption were codified into law. Government agencies arose to support the practices and carry out that law. Communities as small as Shaniko and as large as Portland or Seattle or Boise were built upon and still reflect this institutional architecture. Is it any wonder that they and we are all shaken and disoriented when the consequences of excess consumption, not consumption, but overconsumption, an event we never thought possible, call these institutions and these beliefs into question, especially communities that are still closely tied to the land, resource economies? These feel mostly threatened. They should. They are. These communities don't depend on a silicon forest. They depend on real, and as it turns out, fragile forests of the lava Whitman and Chalice and the Clearwater, and change is coming for them and for us. The wisest heads in these communities recognize it if they do not welcome it. And the transition will be most difficult when it is most abrupt. This kind of change in human history came more slowly before. The values of the 10th or 11th century were not those of the 18th or the 19th, but the change was gradual over 800 years. And the values of the 11th century were less remote from those of the 19th than are the values of the 19th from many of our own. When precipitous change has occurred, as in the Industrial Revolution, the psychological displacement of people was recorded for our instruction, yet not even in that instance were technology and society changing at a pace that approaches our times. And this is the last of these second-order questions. How do we distinguish the means provided us courtesy of the disciplines of science, technology, and economics from the ends, which are the values we inherit and esteem and wish to pass on to our children? The end is not a cost-effective measure to save a salmon, or a light bulb that uses 8 watts, or a solar cell that makes nickel a kilowatt hour electricity. Those are means to comfort, to preserving the planet, and to keeping alive a species that is a part of our identity as Northwesterners. The ends are our values. And the effort to agree on these in a world that shifts and slants and just doesn't seem to keep still anymore is the biggest challenge that we face. Let me give you an example. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, that a proposal was made to the Corps of Engineers some years ago to drop the pool below the Dalles Dam and briefly reveal Celilo Falls for a generation that has no memory of this feature of the river. These massive falls, a few miles above the town of the Dalles, appeared in the journals of Lewis and Clark. They interrupted the travel of pioneers along the Oregon Trail. Celilo and Kettle Falls were the most important fishing sites for Columbia River tribes and therefore of religious significance. The tribal elders were said to have sought the Corps agreement as a kind of a gift to their children. And the Corps declined, of course, for many good and practical reasons, but foremost, I think, because they feared that if once they lowered the reservoir and revealed the falls, they would not be permitted to raise those waters again. A society that has come to value wild and scenic rivers and wilderness areas and threatened species would not have let Celilo be flooded in the first place, or Kettle Falls, or the Cascades of the Columbia, or the Great Falls of the Missouri, or Hetch Hetchy. Society would decide that the value of the visible material falls was greater than the value of an additional increment of electricity. Because we can dam a river is not a reason to do so, but a means that allows choice. How we choose is or should be a function of our values. All the foregoing is complicated, and it is difficult to communicate in the political marketplace which yearns for simple truths. Wishing for a simpler world won't make us one, but there are some lessons to learn and apply, and there are some handholds that we can use, and I'd like to close by suggesting a few of these. We will have to learn to cope with uncertainty and not be paralyzed by it. We will never have conclusive science or economics or a reliable technological crystal ball. We can still choose based on the evidence available. We can be cautious where we know the least. We can research the unknown. Taking no action may sometimes be the right choice, but going limp never will be. We will have to learn to cope with complexity. We cannot allow the debate to be dumbed down. Albert Einstein, who ought to know, said, "Keep it as simple as possible, but not more so." Salmon genetics are not as transparent as the genetics of domestic grains, and we don't know all there is to know about the latter. Salmon migration is not the same, and it is not as simple as getting from point A to point B by the most direct route. Set to work describing the threshold conditions that species need in as much complexity as the subject merits, then don't expect species to prosper with any less. We must remember that market economics and technology can dig us deeper into our hole, or they can be rungs of the ladder we use to climb out on. It depends on what we ask of these tools, for they are tools, and that in turn depends on us being clear about what we value. If it's short-term profits, there are market forces and technologies that will deliver these at a cost. If it's long-term sustainability, well, we can already call on advances in energy and water efficiency and information systems, in traffic management, in high-tech smart windows that gauge heat and light gain, in low-tech concrete that heals itself. Wonderful things. If we're not ready to alter our behavior in significant ways, that technology won't save us. More likely, it will reflect our misplaced values, not compensate for them. It will make the problems more intractable, not less. We need to remember that the pace of change is hard for many people. We need to get enough ahead of our problems with threatened species and polluted airsheds that we can avoid crisis fixes. They're too disruptive, economically and psychologically. They produce denial and polarization and collapse. They just don't give people enough space to adjust. This is another way of stating the equation to be solved. How do we change slow enough for people and fast enough for the fish? We have to ask people to change without overt judgments, value judgments on how they've lived their lives. The change is hard enough and is itself an implicit challenge to their lives and their values and their family histories. Instead of divisive challenges, we have to rediscover our sense of community across the Cascades. down the valley, up to the headwaters of the Columbia. We have to recall, as one writer put it, a time when neighbor was a verb. In his historical writing, Stegner teaches us that interdependence is no less a part of our Western history than is the cowboy myth of individual endeavor, that a Western sense of community was in fact the foundation and the precondition for singular achievement. That is no less true today, and in no place is it truer than in the rural, resource-based communities that hold the fate of the Columbia's headwaters in their hands. We need to begin, as John Wesley Powell advised us a century ago, with the watershed and with the people who live there now. Communities out there will have to turn themselves around back to face their rivers. That's how most early settlements began before the advent of railroads and then of highways. The town of Elgin, where I spent some time, sits astride the Grand Ronde River in northeastern Oregon. 2 years ago, it started an annual Elgin River Days celebration. But the town has no riverside location, not even a park to hold it in. Not yet. But these people are discovering value in their river and in its biological health, value that does not exclude irrigation uses or grazing, but demands respect for other in-stream purposes. And I believe that only if this local sense of place and purpose is awakened and enlisted will national standards and council standards and state standards of watershed health be realized. Such standards will not be successfully imposed from outside or above. At the same time, communities like Elgin have to acknowledge their membership in a larger community, one that occupies the entire Columbia Basin. You and I are a part of that community, here where the Willamette and the Columbia come together. And my interest in the health of the Grand Ronde is no less intense, no less credible than is the interest of the people who live in Elgin. If they and I and you agree on the objective, then I should give deference to their community needs and to their local knowledge of the river and its moods and its quirks, and they and I both must defer to the science. My next thought may seem a little off the wall, but I am more and more convinced of it. We should all read more history. We should all join history book clubs. We should have more history in our curriculum from preschool onward. We should sit our grandparents down and make them talk to us. Through most of human history, we lived with our parents and our grandparents and in the same community and the same landscape where more distant ancestors had preceded us. We could see their legacy to us every day, at every turn in the road, and we understood, however vaguely, that we had a corresponding responsibility to our descendants. The tribal people of the Northwest are almost alone here, I think, in possessing this same connectedness to the land and therefore to their past. The land is the living library of their history. It is the guarantor of their trust obligations, as they put it, to the next 7 generations. Most of us live in much greater isolation from the past and therefore from the future. We rarely live in the same place for long, rarely within the same family circle for a lifetime. Further back than 2 generations is prehistory. The same quaint distance away as the dinosaurs and probably about as relevant to today, we think. We need to discover, or we need to rediscover, that the fundamentals of stewardship lie in our connections to the past and to the future, to our belief that we exist as a community that extends over the full extent of the planet, but also forward and backward in time. E.O. Wilson is a Harvard biologist. He once offered for discussion the Dower hypothesis that people are programmed by their genetic heritage to be so selfish that a sense of global responsibility will come too late. Their genes predispose them to plan ahead for 1 or 2 generations at most. The reason, evolutionary biologists contend, is that this strategy was actually advantageous during all but the last few millennia of human existence. Life was precarious and short, A premium was placed on close attention to the near future, to early reproduction, and those whose genes inclined them to short-term thinking lived longer, had more children than those who did not. It occurs to me that there may be as much Greek tragedy as evolutionary science in this hypothesis. Our species' spectacular success and our downfall proceeding from the same genetic seed, the same outsized brain. Wilson did not in the end accept that as predestined. Human ingenuity, he agreed, may just be capable of that combination of science and modesty that wins through this unique bottleneck in history that lies at the intersection of population pressures and technological genius. But that outcome, he agreed, was very far from assured. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Isaac Regenstrife will ask the first question, but if you'd rather submit written questions, there should be blanks on your tables. Feel free to bring them up here or pass them to the City Club staff in the back. Isaac?
Angus, thank you very much for a very thoughtful talk on the subject. I will get back to a little bit more mundane issue. It's my understanding that next Tuesday the Senate Appropriations Committee is scheduled to take up a proposal which would, in essence, limit Bonneville's expenditures for fish costs, put a cap on that. Would you care to comment for us about what you think about that?
This is the concern that I was referring to, perhaps somewhat too obliquely in my opening comments. I spent most of this morning on the phone on this subject and most of the last few days. The problem, of course, is that Bonneville is trying to adjust from a 60-year history in which it basically was the supplier of choice and the low-cost provider without really working up much of a sweat, to a period of time where its customers are being solicited by lots of other folks out there, and its finances are under considerable stress, and that ends up being magnified by a combination of some misguided nuclear investments that were made back in the 70s that remain with Bonneville and will continue to be paid off for another 15 or 20 years, and the fact that the bills for restoring salmon health are finally coming due on the river, and they are not inexpensive. It's a lot of money, $500 million a year on average. Bonneville is seeking predictability, certainty. That's what a fish cost cap is. I've thought of offering the deal that if they can get a comparable cap arrangement from the creditors who still hold whoops bonds, that we could maybe work a deal, but the market won't allow that sort of unilateral capping of obligations for bonds that are owed on, and we should not allow that kind of unilateral capping of the obligations that we owe to restore the health of the river and the health of the salmon. That is not to say that we do not need to move to try to resolve some of Bonneville's problems and give it a higher degree of predictability, and we are trying to structure some ways of doing that. It is to say also that Bonneville, if it's going to compete, should not have advantages such as capping their liability for the environmental consequences of their actions that other utilities are not permitted to have. Other utilities have to be responsible for the goop that comes out of their smokestacks or the other environmental consequences of their actions, and if we simply hand over to them the right to say how much they can afford and will pay and remain competitive, then an awful lot of environmental gains that we have achieved over the last 25 years will be reversed. And while that may be the mood of the moment, it's not my mood of the moment.
I'm Gordon Green, a member of the City Club, and I'd like to inquire about the status of the salmon runs on the coastal streams where there are no dams and little urban development.
It varies, but many of them are in very severely depressed conditions. You probably saw the headline in the paper a couple of days ago where National Marine Fisheries has has commenced the listing process for coho that come into streams all up and down the coast from California up to Alaska. Sometimes the problems those populations have are advanced to prove the thesis that the dams can't be the problem because there are streams without dams and with depressed fish stocks. Without going into some of the complications of biology and how some stocks decline first and some second and some third, the best answer to that question is that there are multiple reasons why the stocks are declining. If the only impact the Columbia River stocks had were dams, arguably those stocks would be still surviving, if not prospering. We still have a strong run of fall Chinook that come through 4 dams on the Columbia and up into the Hanford Reach. And there they spawn in the last remaining naturally running stretch of the Columbia River. The accumulation of impacts on that stock is not so great that it cannot sustain itself, but it is the accumulation of impacts, whether they are dams or forestry practices that destroy habitat, or overfishing, or any of a combination of other impacts. The accumulation of those impacts is what drives species to extinction, not any one of them. And that's why the fish on the coastal streams are in such serious trouble, many of the stocks, because of harvest practices and habitat degradation that have reduced what the conditions of survival that those fish need below the thresholds that they require.
I'm Don Sterling, a member. Angus, again, I guess this is an example of short-range thinking, but going back to the question of Bonneville's proposed change in its rates, where the industrial users pay less and the residential users pay more. Who referees that proposal?
Well, there is a level at which the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission will referee it, but it will only referee it at a pretty basic level. Are they raising enough revenue to meet their obligations? Are they applying roughly appropriate rate obligations or revenue obligations to like consumers of electricity? Within that, Bonneville has a fair amount of freedom to design its rate structure. And I think it should have a fair amount of freedom to design its rate structure. My biggest concern is not with the shift from residential to industrial so much as it is the shift from what Bonneville considers its core customers, the public utilities, residential and commercial industrial, all, and the direct service industrial customers, the aluminum companies. They're getting the benefit of the rate break. The cost is being shifted to, among others, the residential ratepayers of investor-owned utilities like Pacific Power and Portland General and Puget. And that may not be an inappropriate thing to do in context. That is to say, if Bonneville is moving to try to reorder who it serves and how it charges for that service across the board to reduce or eliminate subsidies, there is a logic to putting that residential exchange with investor-owned utilities on the table, and we've proposed to do that. But Bonneville is still leaving major subsidies to irrigation customers off the table and is declining to deal with those. Its list of things it will look at to shore up its finances is a very narrow one, and it is one that is directed to hold on to its existing core customers at the expense of potentially fish, at the expense of the kind of equitable agreement that we struck in the Northwest Power Act 15 years ago when we agreed that some of that low-cost power could come to residential ratepayers of investor-owned utilities, and now it will not. So the biggest concerns that I have with what Bonneville is doing have less to do with a shift among classes of customers and much more with sort of the fundamental equity of what they're doing, whether they are imposing these costs disproportionately on some users and disproportionately benefiting others. And I think right now they are.
We have a written question. let's look out 20 years from now when there are several million more people living in the Northwest. It's given that we cannot build any more nuclear plants and dams further endanger the remaining salmon. What are we and these new Northwesterners going to do for the power which will be needed?
Well, the council, in collaboration with the utilities and some environmental groups and others, is going to be taking up exactly that question in the current power planning process that just commenced up at the council. But really there are a couple of things, a couple of paths that we could be following. One is a fairly one-dimensional path. It's called build more gas plants. There's lots of natural gas out there. For some people, there is no end to the natural gas, which reminds me of folks who said there was no end to the amount of water available. You know, there will be an end at some point, but there certainly is a lot now. The instincts right now, I think, among most utilities is to respond in a relatively short-term way, focusing on meeting today's market competition by buying low-cost natural gas fired power plants, or the energy from those plants. There is an alternative, and some utilities are contemplating it more or less seriously, and that is conceiving of gas as a bridge resource that will lead, if we are smart about long-range investing, and particularly in technology and research, which will lead to a much more diverse range of energy sources 20 or 30 years from now. That will certainly include gas, will continue to include something like the existing hydro base, but will include more renewable technologies, and will include much more ingenious advances in conservation and efficiency technologies, particularly technologies that rely on information information systems, something that has barely begun to be applied in the energy world today. You know, right now we just turn a light on, we turn a light off, and the information system we rely on is our finger, and when it gets dark and when it gets light. And that's not a bad one. It's pretty functional most of the time. But there are information systems that could turn our hot water on and off in ways that we would never notice when we went to get hot water, but which would end up saving substantial amounts of energy that now go into that hot water. I am very bullish on the potential for efficiency technologies, conservation technologies to be cost competitive, even more so when you consider environmental costs and benefits, but even leaving those aside over the next 20 or 30 years, but only if we invest in those technologies and the research and development required to bring them to fruition when we need them, and we don't wait until we need them to start that cycle.
Andrew Wheeler. Mr. Duncan, I think you used the word heal the river. How would you heal the river? I would suggest maybe that salmon need waterways, or maybe a parallel channel in the Columbia sense, that don't have impoundments, much the way they had it before they got here.
Well, the simplest way and the most straightforward way to heal the river, the only way that would probably guarantee that the fish would come back to something approaching their pre-settlement numbers, is for all of us to pack up and move out. Short of that, it becomes more difficult. What we have to do, the phrase that I have used for 5 years is, we all have to give some of that river back to the fish, and it has to be enough that it meets the threshold requirements of the fish at each stage in its life cycle. It's not enough just to fix the dams and ignore the headwaters, because the fish can die from polluted streams and overheating and siltation of the gravel beds up there. So we have to fix we have to meet those threshold requirements at each stage in the life cycle. Can we do that for that downstream migration period by removing dams? Yeah, we could. I don't think we should. Can we do it by reconfiguring dams and modifying the way they work, so that, for example, during the downstream migration period, we lower the pools behind some of the dams? That moves the water through faster, it moves the fish through faster, the water stays cooler, The predators have a harder time seeing the smolts. It starts looking a little bit more like the river you're talking about before we put dams in. I think that there are ways we can do that. We can ratchet back rather than wipe out our use of the river for hydroelectric generation. And I think that we will come to that. And I will be frankly astonished if 20 years from now the hydroelectric system on that river is running the way it's running today. I think there will be significant changes in a number of the dams, but I think all of the main stem dams will still be there, and I think they will all still be generating electricity. We have looked at alternatives like canals down the side that would have a constantly moving current. We've even looked at a canal that you basically create by putting a membrane in a kind of a tunnel membrane in the middle of the river, and the fish come down through that. Those all, at least so far, go under the heading in my book of trying to solve biological problems with engineering solutions. And so far, they don't work. And they don't show much promise of working. And I, frankly, in the end, have not been able to find anybody, whether they're in the utility industry or the barge industry or the environmental industry, who think that cost-effectively we can, in effect, create a parallel river for the fish. So I don't think that's going to be the solution, but I do think making significant changes in the way the dams are engineered and the way the river is operated through and past those dams, that does hold the set of solutions for that part of the salmon's life cycle. Then you get into the estuary, and we've got an entirely different set of problems in the estuary, and out in the ocean we've got a completely different set out in the ocean, and we have to solve those two or we'll waste our money on the main stem.
Looks like we have no other questions. Thank you for your remarks today, Mr. Duncan. We're adjourned.
Thank you very much.